Now, if you received the midweek email update, you saw the title of my message, and it's kind of a daring thing, because I said in the title that Deuteronomy can be interesting. So if I preach a boring message tonight, I've really done myself in there. But I do teach on the Pentateuch, and so I wanted to share with you tonight some things from one of the books of the Pentateuch. And let us begin by talking about what the Pentateuch is. This is the first 5 books of the Bible, and Moses is the author of the Pentateuch. And it is a connected 5-part series. It's a literary unit. Each book is separate. Each book starts off generally with something to set the stage, but these books do connect. They do go together. We begin with Genesis. The first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis give very broad world history, things like the creation, the flood, the Tower of Babel. The last 39 chapters, it focuses way down to one family, the family of Abraham. So we start with the story of Abraham, then we learn of his son Isaac, we learn of Jacob, we learn of Jacob's sons, and that's where we're left with Jacob, his whole family going down into Egypt, following after his son Joseph, and we're left there at the end of the book of Genesis. In Exodus, we begin in Egypt, and Joseph has been forgotten, and now we have the children of Israel have at some point in the past been put into slavery. God chooses one of these, Moses, who's a Levite, to lead the Israelites out of that slavery. And so they do. There's the Red Sea crossing. They end up in the book of Exodus, of course, dealing with all the plagues and things like that before they cross the Red Sea. After they cross the Red Sea, they end up at Mount Sinai, and there God gives them the law, and we're left there at Sinai at the end of the book of Exodus. In Leviticus, what had happened, one of the instructions given in Exodus was the building of the tabernacle, which they did. But in Leviticus, there's more instruction needed. Now they have a place to worship, but what are they going to do there, and what are the rules, and who are going to be the leaders, and what are those leaders going to do? So it's about the Levites, because God chose the Levites instead of the firstborn. Complicated story, we'll talk about it some other time. But he chooses the Levites, and so now the Leviticus, that is the telling about what the Levites and the priests, which are a subset, just Aaron's sons, are supposed to do. A lot of additional laws about the priesthood in this book. And then we have the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers, by the way, has a way better title in the Hebrew, which is In the Wilderness. Sounds so much more exciting. And of course, the biblical titles, those are not inspired. They're just things that people have chosen based on generally translations of the Bible. We end up with these different book titles. But they are going now in the book of Numbers. The idea is to go in and to take the promised land. But they failed to do that. They do not accept God's call to enter the land, and God says, then you will wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And so that is what they do. And the book of Numbers is a lot of time about a lot of nothing happening for 40 years. There's a few events covered, but not a bunch of events that would take 40 years to happen. Most of that time just spent wandering around. But at the very end of the book of Numbers, you find they actually are now preparing to go and enter the promised land. Not from the south like they were going to originally, but this time from the east. They go up next to the Jordan River, and they begin conquering some tribes that are on the far side called the Transjordan. And there they conquer the kingdoms of Og, who's the king of Bashan. And they also pass through some neighborhoods of people who are relatives, the Moabites and the Edomites. And there they are, sitting on the Transjordan, about ready to cross over. And during that time, they receive the book of Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy, let's go ahead and turn there. I'm going to do my best. I want us to go from front to back in this book, and I want us to talk about what Deuteronomy is about. If you turn to Deuteronomy, look at the very top of the page. And what you should see up there is the word Deuteronomy. What does that mean? Well, let me give you an example from drama. You've probably heard of the protagonist in drama, right? The protagonist is the leading character, and then there is an antagonist who's an opposing character against the protagonist. But if you are really into drama and you've studied these things out, you may know that there's actually a title given for the second person in importance, and that is the deuteragonist, because deutero means second. All right, the deuteragonist is the second most important, but Deuteronomy means second. Well, that's what deuter means, but what about nomi at the end of the book there? Well, think of some other words that end in nomi. You have astronomy, which is the laws of space and celestial bodies. You have taxonomy, which is laws of categorization. You have autonomy, which means self-governed or a law unto oneself. Notice anything similar about all of those? Because nomi means law. So Deuteronomy means the second law, or sometimes said the second giving of the law. And as I said, Bible titles aren't inspired, and this is one that many people have kind of considered to be somewhat of a misnomer, because Deuteronomy isn't exactly the second law. It's really an expanding of the existing laws. But nonetheless, there are more specific provisions given in Deuteronomy than we saw earlier in the book of Exodus. And so the titles that we have for the other books, you have Genesis, that is Bereshith, it means in the beginning, just from the first words of the book in Hebrew. Exodus, the Hebrew title is Shemot, which means names. Leviticus is Vayikra, which means and he called. Again, Hebrew titles just from the first letters of the book. Numbers is Bamidbar, in the wilderness. And the word title for Deuteronomy is just these are the words, which just comes from the beginning words of the book. Now, let's talk about the setting. I explained how they ended up in that location. They crossed ultimately into the borders of what would become Israel. Israel would have some of this Transjordan, but they had not crossed over the Jordan River to be into the Israel proper. It was still the Transjordan. Now, as Moses is preparing, God has already told Moses at this point, you are not going to enter the promised land proper yourself. You're not going to cross over the Jordan River and go into what will one day be Israel. And so Moses knows that there's going to be somebody else who's going to come and lead the people. These people he cares about an awful lot. He's been leading them now for 40 years. And so Moses is going to give several sermons to prepare the children of Israel for a time when he is no longer the one leading them. And you see that in chapter 1, verse 1. These be the words which Moses spake. Moses is the speaker. Kind of an interesting thing. Compared to a lot of the rest of the Bible, you don't see this so much. But look at verse 16. And I charge your judges, right? He's speaking in first person. This is a sermon of Moses. Moses is actually speaking the book of Deuteronomy. You also see in verse 2, there are 11 days' journey from Horeb. What does this tell us? It took them 40 years. It's an 11-day journey. 11-day journey took 40 years. It's kind of a little reminder what happens when you don't follow God's will. It could take you 40 years to do an 11-day journey. And then in verse 3, it came to pass in the 40th year. So there we go. 40th year, 40 years is all the time they need to wander. It's the 40th year now, so they're getting ready to enter into the promised land for real. Now, what about the content? Deuteronomy is one of the top 3 Old Testament books that is cited by New Testament authors, and I'm going to try to refer to a lot of these tonight. The other 2 are Psalms and Isaiah and Deuteronomy, right there in the top 3 of New Testament quoted books. And you might, even if you try to think, what are some examples? We'll get to some of them, because there's really good stuff in Deuteronomy, and Christ really cared to quote about it himself. 21 out of the 27 New Testament books quote the book of Deuteronomy. And the book, another thing that people will talk about when they discuss this book is the structure of the book. It's structured like what's called a suzerainty treaty. In the ancient Near East and in places like the Hittite kingdom, they would have a suzerainty treaty between a suzerain or a lord and the vassal or the subject. And they would draw up a treaty in a very specific way that would have laws and rules to follow, punishments that would happen if they were not observed, blessings if they were observed, and such. And that is the way that God chooses to give the book of Deuteronomy in this suzerainty treaty setup. And so these were rules that the Israelites were to live by and to be a theocracy under the leadership of their suzerain, their Lord, their God, Jehovah. And remember, though, despite all of that, salvation for the Israelites was by faith too. It was not by keeping the law, because nobody ever kept the law perfectly other than Jesus. So now we're going to do an overview. We don't obviously have time enough to even read the whole book, let alone to explain it. So we're going to jump through the chapters from front to back, look at the best parts. So here in Deuteronomy, I'm going to read something from the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, it says in chapter 22, and said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hath not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven. You may recognize this as the words that God speaks to Abraham when he chooses Abraham to be the beginning of this chosen nation. He says, I will multiply thy seed as the stars of heaven. Now you're here in Deuteronomy chapter 1. Look at verse number 10. The Lord your God hath multiplied you, and behold, ye are this day as the stars of heaven for multitude. So right here in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 10, we see the fulfillment of that statement that God makes to Abraham. Oh, were they ever as the stars of heaven? Yes, right here, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 10, we find out that promise is fulfilled. Then in the book of James, look here in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 17. It says, Ye shall not respect persons in judgment, but ye shall hear the small as well as the great. You shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is God's, and the cause that is too hard for you, bring it to me, and I will hear it. Ye shall not respect persons in judgment. In James chapter 2, I'll start in verse number 8. It says, If ye fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, ye do well. But if ye have respect to persons, ye commit sin and are convinced of the law as transgressors. So maybe you've seen that in the book of James. James is a great book. What was James talking about? James was talking about this here in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 17. James says, if you have respect to persons, the law calls you a transgressor. And here's in the law where it says it, in Deuteronomy 1, verse 17. Now, chapters 2 through 3 are Moses actually retelling the events that happen in the book of Numbers. So I could cover those right now, but maybe I want to preach on Numbers sometime and do it then instead. So I'm just going to skip through chapters 2 and 3 right now, and let's go to chapter number 4. And look at verse number 2. You shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall you diminish aught from it, that ye may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you. Someone took inspiration, I believe, from this in Deuteronomy to write something else, and that was the Apostle John in the book of Revelation, where he says, For I testify unto every man that heareth the words of this prophecy of this book, if any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book. Notice that in chapter 4, verse 2, you shall not add unto the word. John says in Revelation, if any man shall add unto these things. Then you notice next there in chapter 4, verse 2, neither shall you diminish. John says in Revelation, and if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life and out of the holy city and from the things which are written in this book. So if you've noticed that stipulation there near the end of the book of Revelation, realize that this isn't some new strange thing he's bringing up. He's read this many times in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, Paul also quotes from the book of Deuteronomy. Here in chapter 4, look down at verse number 15. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 15. Now, go ahead and you can just kind of let your eyes rest over verses 15 through 18. I'll read them in a moment. I'm going to read Romans chapter 1, verse 21 through 23 first, though. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. So this is Paul talking about the downward spiral of apostasy, and he mentions that people changing the glory of the uncorruptible God into image made like the corruptible man. Notice this in verse 16 here in chapter 4. Lest you corrupt yourselves and make ye a graven image, the similitude of any figure, the likeness of male or female. Paul says, made like the corruptible man. Deuteronomy says, the likeness of any beast that is on the earth. And Paul says, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things and such. You see that this again, Paul isn't just making something new here. He's actually quoting something from the book of Deuteronomy. The person who is in this downward spiral of apostasy ultimately ends up violating the same principles that God felt he needed to give to the children of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 4. Now, still in chapter 4, look down in verse 24. It says, For the Lord thy God is a consuming fire, even a jealous God. Maybe you've read this passage in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 28 and 29. Wherefore, we receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace, whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. All right, and so the author of Hebrews quotes from Deuteronomy 4, verse 24. There's another great thing in chapter 4, and it just continues there in the next verses. In verse 25, When thou shalt beget children and children's children, and ye shall have remained long in the land, and shall corrupt yourselves, and make a graven image or the likeness of anything, and shall do evil in the sight of the Lord thy God to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day that you shall soon utterly perish from off the land, whereunto you go over Jordan to possess it. Okay, so this is initially, God is prophetically predicting here that the Israelites are going to be kicked out of Israel. Let's keep reading. You shall not prolong your days upon it, but shall utterly be destroyed. That happened. And the Lord shall scatter you among the nations, and you shall be left few in number among the heathen, whither the Lord shall lead you. That happened. And there you shall serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. But if from thence thou shalt seek the Lord thy God, thou shalt find him, if thou seek him with all thy heart and with all thy soul. When thou art in tribulation, and all these things are come upon thee, even in the latter days, if thou turn to the Lord thy God, and shall be obedient unto his voice, for the Lord thy God is a merciful God, he will not forsake thee, neither destroy thee, nor forget the covenant of thy fathers, which he sware unto them. So this is a prophetic prediction of the Jewish diaspora and God's promise of future return and future restoration here in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Very important thing to see as you read through the book of Deuteronomy. Now in chapter 5 is the second telling of the Ten Commandments. You're probably more familiar with the telling that's in the book of Exodus, but we will quote these a little bit because later on we're going to see that the book of Deuteronomy has some other things to tell us about the Ten Commandments. But I'm not initially going to look at them. You're probably familiar with the Ten Commandments. So let's look at chapter number 6. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, there's actually a passage that's quoted by the Lord Jesus Christ. Christ is talking to a Jewish scribe in the New Testament. In the book of Mark, it says this, "And Jesus answered him, the first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength." This is the first commandment. Now here in chapter 6, verse 4 through 5, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might." This is a very important command in Judaism. It's called the Shema. It's the most important part of the Bible for a Jewish person today. And so they were very, very familiar with this. Christ quotes it to the scribe. What does the scribe say back in this case? In Mark chapter 12, verse 32, "And the scribe said unto him, Well, master, thou hast said the truth, for there is one God, and there is none other but he." Which, if you flip back to Deuteronomy chapter 4 and look at verse number 35, you'll see the scribe was actually quoting Deuteronomy also. "Unto thee it was showed that thou mightest know that the Lord, he is God, there is none else beside him." So in this passage in Mark chapter 12, we read of Jesus Christ talking to a scribe. He quotes a bit of Deuteronomy, and the scribe quotes a bit of Deuteronomy back in their discussion here. Jesus was very familiar with Deuteronomy. The scribes were very familiar with Deuteronomy. And so this is where they went when they wanted to quote the Bible, because this is where the law is. This was the most important thing for them. In fact, the very next set of quotes that we will talk about tonight from the book of Deuteronomy are also on the lips of Jesus Christ. And if you would, flip forward to chapter number 8. I'll read from Matthew chapter 4, verses 3 through 10. We'll just start with the first few verses. In Matthew 4, verse 3, it says, "And when the tempter came to him, he said, If thou be the Son of God, command that these stones be made bread. But he answered and said, It is written, Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God." Look at chapter 8, verse 3. "And he humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live." So when Jesus Christ is tempted of the devil, he comes here to the book of Deuteronomy, and he quotes this in chapter 8. Now let's look back at the temptation. "Then the devil taketh him up into the holy city, and setteth him on a pinnacle of the temple." And how did Jesus respond when he said, "If you're the Son of God, cast yourself down"? Jesus said unto him, "It is written again, Thou shalt not tempt the Lord your God." Flip back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and look at verse 16. "Ye shall not tempt the Lord your God as ye tempted him in Massah." So again, and the temptation of Christ, first he quotes Deuteronomy, then a second temptation, again he quotes Deuteronomy. Back to the temptation in the New Testament. "Then saith Jesus unto him, Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve." And this one here is a little bit difficult to see the parallel perfectly due to the translation, but you'll find that this one is in chapter 6, verse 13. Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God and serve him, and shalt swear by his name. So all three times when Christ responds with Scripture to the temptation, he does it from the book of Deuteronomy. Now, flip back forward to chapter 8 and look at verse number 5. Chapter 8, verse number 5, it says, Thou shalt also consider in thine heart that as a man chasteneth his son, so the Lord thy God chasteneth thee. The author of Hebrews again quotes from the book of Deuteronomy here in this passage. Hebrews 12 says, For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as sons. For what son is he who the Father chasteneth not? It may be more familiar to you hearing it in the words that are said in Hebrews, but notice it's a quote from the book of Deuteronomy. By the way, the Bible is far more than these other works which purport to be Scripture, far more connected in ways that it refers to itself like this. You look at the Book of Mormon, which does make references to the Old and New Testament. You look at the Islamic law, which, of course, in the Quran, there are references between individual surahs of it. It's paltry compared to what you find in the New Testament, referring back to the Old Testament. It shows a very knowledgeable group of people who wrote our New Testament, very familiar with the Old Testament, and these references are everywhere. Deuteronomy chapter 10, and look at verse number 17. Deuteronomy 10:17. This one is actually quoted multiple times in the New Testament. Deuteronomy 10:17 says, For the Lord your God is God of gods, and a Lord of lords, a great God, a mighty and a terrible, which regardeth not persons, nor taketh reward. Peter quotes it in Acts 10:34. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. And notice that at the end of verse number 17. Paul quotes it in Romans 2:11, For there is no respect of persons with God. He also quotes it in Galatians, Colossians, and 1 Timothy. Paul really liked this passage. John quotes it in Revelation. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. A quote here from the book of Deuteronomy. I believe Deuteronomy can be interesting, and one of the things that's very fascinating, and honestly, maybe I missed it, because I'm sure Pastor Skevings referred to it, and I'm sure maybe many of you have heard of this. But Deuteronomy has this section called the Deuteronomic Code in chapters 12 through 26. It's really the core of the book. And the Deuteronomic Code is structured like the Ten Commandments. In other words, there's a section on the first commandment, then the second, third, fourth, all the way to the 10th commandment. Let's look at it with the time we have. The first commandment, now I'm going to quote from we're in here in Deuteronomy, so I'm going to quote from the Deuteronomy version of the Ten Commandments. So the first commandment is, Thou shalt have none other gods before me. The laws based on this commandment are in chapter 12, verses 1 through chapter 12, verse 31. And the key theme is exclusive worship of Jehovah God. So for an example, look at chapter 12, verses 2 through 3. You shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which ye shall possess serve their gods, upon the high mountains and upon the hills and under every green tree. And you shall overthrow their altars and break their pillars and burn their groves with fire. And you shall hew down the graven images of their gods and destroy the names of them out of that place. So the command is have no other gods. And so the expansion on this in the Deuteronomic Code in Deuteronomy is the idea of exclusive worship of Jehovah, and it's handled by getting rid of worship places to false gods here. Then the second commandment, Thou shalt not make thee any graven image, thou shalt not bow thyself down unto them, nor serve them. Laws based on this section are in chapter 12, verse 32 through chapter 13, verse 18. The theme now is handling idolatrous people. So in chapter 13, and we see in verse number 1, If there arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and giveth thee a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder come to pass whereof he spake unto thee, saying, Let us go after other gods, which thou hast not known, and let us serve them, thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. So we see that the idea of exclusive worship of God, not bowing down to any graven image, is enforced here and expanded upon by saying, what about if a person comes and tries to make you do it, and gives some instruction on that. Of course, there's other things in this section. The third one I find is maybe the most difficult to see the parallel. The third command is, Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. And the section, as we lay out the Deuteronomic Code, the section that seems to apply to this is chapter 14, verses 1 through 21. And I would say that the theme here is representing God's name rightly through behavior. But that behavior specifically, as in the Deuteronomic Code, in chapter 14, is the food laws. And in chapter 14, it says in verses 2 through 4, "For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God, and the Lord hath chosen thee to be a peculiar people unto himself above all the nations that are upon the earth. Thou shalt not eat any abominable thing. These are the beasts which ye shall eat, the ox, the sheep, and the goat," and so forth. It's, I think, the hardest one to understand the direct connection to the command, but it's representing God's name rightly through behavior. Now, one thing I want to point out in chapter 14 is that the tradition based on Deuteronomy is what produced the kosher laws of Israel or of the Jewish people today. In chapter 14, verse 21, we encounter this strange verse: "You shall not eat anything that dieth of itself. Thou shalt give it unto the stranger that is in thy gates, that he may eat it, or thou mayest sell it unto an alien. For thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not seethe a kid in his mother's milk." Thou shalt not boil a goat, that is, in the milk of its mother. Very unusual, precise law. In fact, there's some Bible scholars who have said that this was a Canaanite practice of actually having a goat that would be boiled in this way as a ceremony. There's different interpretations about why particularly this is prohibited here. But from this one law about not boiling a goat in its mother's milk is the Jewish kosher law, which says you cannot mix any milk and meat product. And so you cannot have there's no such thing as a kosher cheeseburger or a chicken fried steak if it has milk in what's put on top of it. And so if you go to an observant Jewish house, you'll have either a milk meal or you'll have a meat meal. You'll never have the two mixed together. That all comes from this one verse here in the book of Deuteronomy. Continuing, the fourth commandment is keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it. And the laws on this commandment are in chapter 14, verse 22 through chapter 16, verse 17. And the theme then is special Sabbaths and holy days, like you see in chapter 15, verses 1 through 2. "At the end of every 7 years thou shalt make a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release." So the law of the 7th year Sabbath, and there's some other Sabbath-related laws here because this is based on the fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment. The fifth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. Laws based on this commandment are in chapter 16, verse 18 through chapter 18, verse 22. The theme is authority figures, and you can find this, for example, in chapter 16, verse 18, where it says, "Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee throughout thy tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment." So in the same way you're supposed to honor your father and mother, there are other authority figures in the Jewish person's life, and this is an example of it. Now, another example of somebody referencing this section of the law is chapter 17, verse 6, where it says, "At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. But at the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death." And verse 7, "The hands of the witnesses shall be first upon him to put him to death." This is quoted several times in the New Testament. Christ quotes it in John 8:7. "So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." In the case of the woman taken in adultery, why is Jesus saying, that somebody should be first to cast a stone at her? Verse 7, "The hands of the witnesses shall be first upon him to put him to death." All right? It's a command in the book of Deuteronomy. Hey, if you're going to do this, let's do it right. It's not my job to cast a stone at her, Jesus says. And then Paul quotes it in 1 Timothy 5:19. He says, "Against an elder receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses." So he's taking an Old Testament command and bringing that 2 or 3 witness principle into the New Testament. The author of Hebrews does in Hebrews 10:28. "He that despised Moses' law died without mercy under 2 or 3 witnesses," it says in Hebrews. So obviously the author of the book of Hebrews is very familiar with the Deuteronomic law here. Christ also quotes Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 13 in the Sermon on the Mount. In Deuteronomy 18:13 it says, "Thou shalt be perfect with the Lord thy God." And in Matthew chapter 5, where Christ is giving his Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." All right? So if you're just reading through the the Sermon on the Mount, you may not catch that Christ is actually quoting the book of Deuteronomy there. There's also a very important messianic promise here in this part of Deuteronomy. So in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, this is Moses speaking, and he says, "The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him ye shall hearken." This is kind of an interesting one. Okay, a prophet. Not a lot of specifics. He doesn't say a name or anything like that. "The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet like unto me." The priests and Levites were quizzing John the Baptist in the New Testament. In John chapter 1, verse 2, it says, "And they asked him, What then? Art thou Elias? And he said, I am not. Art thou that prophet? And he answered, No. That prophet? Yeah, they're referring back to this one, where Moses says that there will be a prophet. Not enough detail given to say. So they knew, though. Everybody, when you say that prophet, we're talking about this one. John the Baptist said, I'm not that prophet. Christ referred to this passage also in John 5:46. He said, For had ye believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. It's a great one, John 5:46. Where did Moses write of Christ? Right here, that prophet. The crowd, after the feeding of the 5,000, they speak. It says in John chapter 6, verse 14, Then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. And Stephen, right before he's being stoned in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 7, he says, This is that Moses, which said unto the children of Israel, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me, him shall ye hear. So Stephen, when he's preaching, he identifies Jesus Christ directly as that prophet. So a very important messianic prophecy here. The sixth command is thou shalt not kill. Laws based on this command are in chapter 19, verse 1 through 22, verse 8. The theme is taking human life. In chapter 19, verse 5, we have an example. It says, As when a man goeth into the wood with his neighbor to hew wood, and his hand fetcheth a stroke with the axe to cut down the tree, and the head slippeth from the helve, and lighteth upon his neighbor that he die, he shall flee unto one of these cities and live. So what happens then? Okay, you're not supposed to kill, but what happens if you're just chopping wood and the axe head goes off and kills somebody? And that's where there's further provision given in Deuteronomy to expand on that command. In this case, you go to one of the special cities of refuge until the high priest dies, or until you die, one of the two, that's where you're going to live. In chapter 22, verse 8, it says, When thou buildest a new house, then thou shalt make a battlement for thy roof, that thou bring not blood upon thy house, if any man fall from thence. So here's another example of thou shalt not kill, a requirement that you actually build some kind of a fence around the edge of your roof so somebody doesn't trip and fall off of it and die, because if you did, you're negligent. So this is all part of the idea of having respect for human life. This is also another part of the section that Christ quotes from in the Sermon on the Mount, back in chapter 19 and verse number 21. Chapter 19, 21 says, And thine eye shall not pity, but life shall go for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And in Matthew chapter 5, Christ says, Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. This is where Christ adds some New Testament expansion on Old Testament law, and the law he quotes from is, of course, where else? It's from the book of Deuteronomy, where all these specific laws are given. Paul quotes from the book of Deuteronomy in this section to explain the atonement. In chapter 21, look at verse number 22. And if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, somebody might have preached on this recently, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God, that the land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. And of course, Galatians 3:13 says, Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, Cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. The seventh command is, Neither shalt thou commit adultery. There are laws based on this command in chapter 22, verse 9 through chapter 23, verse 18. This theme is adulterating, that is improper mixing, and sexual immorality. So one example is chapter 22, verse 9 through 11, where it says, "Thou shalt not sow thy vineyard with diverse seeds, lest the fruit of thy seed which thou hast sown and the fruit of the vineyard be defiled. Thou shalt not plow with an ox and an ass together. Thou shalt not wear a garment of diverse sorts, as of woolen and linen together." Improper mixing, adulterating something, right? That's why it's in the section under this commandment, "Neither shalt thou commit adultery." But also, sexual immorality is, of course, you'd expect, expanded on here as well. Look at chapter 22, verse 23. "If a damsel that is a virgin be betrothed unto a husband, and a man find her in the city and lie with her, then you shall bring them both out unto the gate of that city, and you shall stone them with stones that they die. The damsel, because she cried not, being in the city." All right, so if a woman is attacked in a city, or in this case, you discover if it's an attack. If she's attacked in a city, she's going to cry out. You're going to catch it. But if they find out that there's been adultery in a city and nobody cried out, you would have known. The cities are very dense and packed. Then they're both put to death. And so, because it's in a city. But, okay, but what if she did cry out and nobody heard her because she was somewhere else? We'll just keep reading. Verse 25, "But if a man find a betrothed damsel in the field, and the man force her and lie with her, then the man only that lay with her shall die. But unto the damsel thou shalt do nothing. There is in the damsel no sin worthy of death." Well, it was in the field. Nobody could hear her, even if she did cry, so she's spared. So this is expansion on these laws, "Neither shalt thou commit adultery." The eighth command, "Neither shalt thou steal." The laws based on this are in chapter 23, verse 19, through chapter 24, verse 7. The theme is proper and improper taking. An example is 23, verse 19, where it says, "Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury." So usury, the idea of having a rate of interest that is exorbitant, is something that was prohibited here under the commands of not stealing. The ninth command, "Neither shalt thou bear false witness against thy neighbor." Laws on this are in chapter 24, verse 8 through chapter 25, verse 4. The theme is honest treatment of others as opposed to the false witness. I like this one in chapter 23, verse number 10. 24, verse number 10. "When thou dost lend thy brother anything, thou shalt not go into his house to fetch his pledge. Thou shalt stand abroad, and the man to whom thou dost lend shall bring out the pledge abroad unto thee." All right? So you borrow something from somebody, and it's time to get it back. You don't just go breaking into the house and just taking it from... Have some respect. Tell him what he's supposed to bring out. He'll go in, and he'll bring it out to you. And this is the idea of honest treatment of others as opposed to false witness against thy neighbor. Paul actually mentions, apart from this section, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3 says, 40 stripes he may give him and not exceed. The amount of a 40-stripe punishment is the most that's permitted here. In 2 Corinthians 11:24, Paul says, "Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one." So the Jews continued to observe this rule. They took one off because, if you do 40, you might lose count and actually do 41 by accident, and that would be a violation of the law. So they do it, save one. But this is where the restriction is, right here in this section. He also quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. "Thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn." Why not? Well, you have an animal who's here. His whole job is to walk around in a circle and tread the corn to break it up. He's hungry. You have him here doing a food job, and you've muzzled him so he can't have any of it. And God says that's unfair treatment. How does Paul use this in the New Testament? In 2 Corinthians 11, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, he says, "Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially them who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture saith, Thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward." Paul says if somebody is doing the job of the gospel, they are preaching, they are serving, they are doing the ministry of the church, then they should have the right to be paid from the church. This is the whole subject here. When he says double honor, that refers to money. And so Paul is giving explicit permission here for people to be paid because you're not supposed to muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn. The 10th command, "Neither shalt thou covet anything that is thy neighbor's." Laws based on this are in chapter 25, verses 5 through 19. The theme is right intentions. "Thou shalt," it says in chapter 25, verse 13, "Thou shalt not have in thy bag diverse weights, a great and a small." Well, why not? Why can't you have 2 different weights? What's the purpose here? When you go to the market and you're going to buy some grain. If you have two different weights, a great and a small, the idea is they both say, let's say, for example, in modern terms, 1 pound. But you have a 1 pound that weighs a little less, and you have a 1 pound that weighs a little more. And when you buy, and you want to buy a pound, you bring out, the one that will give you the better deal. And when you sell, you bring out the other one. And that way you're making a little bit in the trade. Now, why is that listed here in this section? Well, just having the weights doesn't mean anything, right? They're just in the bag. But the command is right intentions. If you have the weights, if you even have them, that's an indication that there's some wrong intentions going on there. You're intending to do something wrong, so you're not even allowed to have the weights. And so that's the section of the Deuteronomic Code on the Ten Commandments. There's a section in chapter 27 through chapter 8 about blessings and curses when they enter in the promised land. There's going to be a ceremony in a couple mountains to do it. I'd talk about it more if I had more time. But let's cover a few more times when the book of Deuteronomy is covered in the New Testament. Look in chapter 29, verse 4. Chapter 29, verse 4. Yet the Lord hath not given you a heart to perceive, and eyes to see, and ears to hear unto this day. Now, this is Moses, and he's talking to the children of Israel when he says this here in Deuteronomy, right? He's preaching his sermon, and he says this to them. In the book of Romans, we read this. What then? Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. According as it is written, God hath given them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear unto this day. Romans, a great doctrinal book, an excellent book. So many sermons can be preached on it. And Paul, when he writes the book of Romans, quotes here from the book of Deuteronomy. He also quotes Moses in his defense of Christ and introduces a familiar salvation passage. I love this one because you're probably really familiar with this salvation passage, but may not even realize the connection it has to Deuteronomy. So let's look at chapter 30. Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse number 11. Chapter 30, starting in verse 11. For this commandment which I command thee this day, it is not hidden from thee, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that thou shouldest say, who shall go up for us to heaven and bring it unto us that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea that thou shouldest say, who shall go over the sea for us and bring it unto us that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very nigh unto thee in thy mouth and in thy heart that thou mayest do it. Now, Paul quotes this in the book of Romans. But the righteousness which is of faith speaketh on this wise, say not in thy heart, who shall ascend into heaven, that is, to bring Christ down from above? Or, who shall descend in the deep, that is, to bring up Christ again from the dead? But what saith it? The word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thine heart. That is the word of faith which we preach, that if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. You're probably familiar with Romans 10, 9, and 10. But did you realize it's preceded with a direct reference here to Deuteronomy chapter 30? Paul quotes Deuteronomy to the Athenians in Greece. In chapter 32, verse 8, you can see this. Chapter 32, verse 8. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. When Paul is talking to the Athenians in Acts chapter 17, he says, For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. And hath made of one blood, he says in verse 26, all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth. Chapter 32, verse 8 says, divided the nations. And then he says this, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitations. That's there in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8. So Paul, even when he's speaking to the Athenians, he goes back and he uses the book of Deuteronomy. There's so many quotes, and I'm running out of time to tell them all to you. But I want to say there's one other thing right at the very end of the book of Deuteronomy, which is really neat. And that's the Song of Moses. Did you know that Moses preached, number one. Did you know that Moses preached and his sermon is here in the book of Deuteronomy? I think that's interesting. But he also gave them a song. And the only thing I really wish is that we still had the music, because wouldn't it be neat to be able to sing the Song of Moses to the music that they sang it to? But we can still sing it because it's still in here. And the Song of Moses, you can see in chapter 31, verse 19, it says, Now therefore write ye this song for you, and teach it the children of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the children of Israel. And then if you look forward to chapter 31, verse 30, it says, And Moses spake in the ears of all the congregation of Israel the words of this song until they were ended. And then chapter 32, you can start to read the song. There are two examples that I will give tonight of the New Testament authors quoting from the song, which is pretty neat too. In chapter 32, verse 35, we're in the middle of the song here, it says, "To me belongeth vengeance and recompense. Their foot shall slide in due time, for the day of their calamity is at hand, and the things that shall come upon them make haste." In Romans 12:19, probably familiar with this, "Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." It's a quote from Moses' song. And in Hebrews 10:30, "For we know him that has said, Vengeance belongeth unto me, I will recompense, saith the Lord. And again, the Lord shall judge his people." But the second place that is quoted in the Song of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy may be something that you wouldn't expect. Look at this in chapter 32, verse 43. It says, "Rejoice, O ye nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants, and will render vengeance to his adversaries, and will be merciful unto his land and to his people." You know, one day the martyrs in heaven will call on God to fulfill this promise from the Song of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. We read this in Revelation. "And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth?" See what it says in Deuteronomy 32:43? "He will avenge the blood of his servants." And then in Revelation 19, verses 1 through 2, many chapters later, after God has judged, we read this. "And after these things I heard a great voice of much people in heaven, saying, Alleluia, salvation and glory and honor and power unto the Lord our God. For true and righteous are his judgments. For he hath judged the great whore, which did corrupt the earth with her fornication, and hath avenged the blood of his servants at her hand." And so God ultimately does fulfill this promise that was spoken of here in the Song of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy. The final thing in the book of Deuteronomy is that Moses dies. We find this in the very end of the book, in chapter 34, the last chapter, and the final words of the book in verses 10 through 12. "And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and the wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh, and to all his servants, and to all his land, and in all that mighty hand, and in all the great terror which Moses showed in the sight of all Israel." And that concludes the Pentateuch, and that whole section. Moses wrote it. It ends with his death, and within it are all these wonderful references that are quoted again in the New Testament. And I believe, and I hope you believe too, that Deuteronomy can be interesting. All right, let's close in prayer.